Dean had always approached the world with the precision of a blueprint. As an urban planner, he dealt in logic, in angles and elevations, in the predictable flow of traffic and the calculated placement of infrastructure. Superstition was a flaw in the system, a rogue variable he simply ignored. Which made his current predicament, the inheritance of Blackwood Manor, an exercise in profound irony. The estate lawyer's hushed tones about the distant relative's peculiar demise, the local estate agent's averted gaze, and the villagers' anachronistic whispers of a hungry house, he'd filed it all under quaint, rural eccentricity. The drive itself had been a descent into isolation. His sleek sedan, usually at home navigating city grids, now bucked and scraped along a gravel track that wound through skeletal pines, their needles forming a thick, damp carpet. He'd passed no other vehicle for miles, the last sign of civilization a faded signpost pointing towards a defunct canyon research site, a project he'd once reviewed the preliminary environmental impact reports for, another forgotten outpost of human ambition. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something cloying and ancient, like forgotten autumn leaves left to rot beneath a shroud of moss. Then, Blackwood Manor loomed. It was less a house and more a monolithic shadow against the bruised sky. Gnarled ivy, thick as anaconda coils, strangled the stone facade, pulling at the eaves, obscuring what might once have been grand windows. The roof sagged in places, a broken tooth in a gaping maw. No smoke curled from its chimneys, no light pierced its gloom. A shiver, sharp and unbidden, traced a path down Dean's spine. He shouldered his duffel bag, the only luggage he'd brought for what he intended to be a swift appraisal and sale. The front door, a slab of oak scarred with centuries of weather, groaned open at his touch, not quite inviting, more like a sigh of weary resignation. He spent the first hour methodically moving through the ground floor, his planner's eye assessing structural integrity, potential for renovation. Every room felt like a tomb, heavy with the scent of decay and something indefinable, metallic and sweet. In what must have been a study, behind a bookshelf warped by time and damp, his fingers brushed against a loose panel. Curiosity, purely academic, spurred him to pry it open. Inside, nestled amongst crumbling ledgers and brittle maps, was a stack of small, leather-bound journals. Their covers were cracked, the pages yellowed and fragile. They were not neatly organized, but scattered, as if hastily hidden. He pulled one free, its binding groaning. The script inside was spidery, almost frantic. He flipped through pages, catching fragments. The pact. The sustenance. Must be willing. Another journal, different hand, same unsettling tone. The house hungers. It demands. The great maw. Always watching, always waiting at the canyon research site. Dean frowned, the phrase about the research site jarring him. It felt out of place, a modern intrusion into this ancient madness. He tried to rationalize it, perhaps a metaphor, a local landmark. But the sheer repetition of Hungry House and the Pact began to chip away at his pragmatic resolve. He felt a prickle of unease, a foreign sensation that twisted his gut. Dean reached for his flashlight, its beam a meager defiance against the encroaching gloom. He held his breath, listening, but there was nothing. Then it came. A sound, or rather, an impression of a sound. His name. Dean. It was soft, drawn out, like air escaping a dying breath. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He snapped his head up, shining the flashlight beam wildly. Nothing. only the dust motes still dancing in the air, mocking his sudden panic. He told himself it was the house, the old wood, the wind playing tricks. He was tired, stressed. He stood, forcing himself to walk to the doorway, peering into the inky blackness of the hall. He swept the beam left, then right. Empty. Completely empty. He was alone. Utterly alone. He took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to steady his frayed nerves. The pragmatic urban planner was losing his grip, one unsettling flicker at a time. The house, he realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just old, it felt profoundly, malevolently aware. The soft, drawn-out sigh of the house had been nothing, he'd told himself. Just old wood settling, the wind finding a new seam in the ancient siding. Dean gripped the flashlight, its beam a meager spear against the encroaching gloom. He was a man of concrete plans and measurable outcomes. Urban planning had no room for phantom exhalations or dancing dust motes. He would find the source of these unsettling noises, these perceived shifts in the air, and he would fix them. This place was old, not alive. His investigation began methodically. He ran his hands along the spines of forgotten tomes, then along the dark wood paneling, searching for a loose board, a hidden catch. His fingers snagged on an almost imperceptible seam behind a particularly large, leather-bound volume on local flora. He pushed. A section of the wall, disguised perfectly, swung inward with a faint groan, revealing not a pantry, but a narrow, unlit passage. A gust of air, thick with the smell of damp earth and something acrid, rushed out, extinguishing his practical, urban planner's resolve for a moment. He hesitated, then pushed forward, his determination hardening. This was a secret, not a ghost. Roots, thick as a man's arm, snaked through cracks in the stone, twisting like petrified veins. The passage opened into a sub-basement, a cavernous space where the ceiling was a tangle of raw earth and more grasping roots. His beam swept across the floor, catching on something low and irregular. He stepped closer, the crunch of loose shale beneath his boots echoing strangely. And on it, half buried under a scatter of dry leaves and soil, were bones. Not a complete skeleton, but enough to confirm a terrible presence. Ribs, brittle and yellowed, fanned out beside it. These weren't animal remains. His light played over the damp walls, revealing crude carvings etched into the stone and packed earth. Jagged lines formed abstract figures, some vaguely human, others monstrous, all connected by swirling patterns that seemed to pulse with a silent, malevolent energy. This wasn't just a hidden room, it was a shrine, a place of sacrifice. He backed away, the skeletal remains and the unsettling carvings burning into his mind. He had to get out, had to call someone. He fumbled for his phone, his thumb pressing the call icon. Nothing. No signal. He ascended the steps, heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his sternum, the passage closing behind him with an unnerving finality. Outside, the late afternoon light was already fading. He ran to his car, parked on the overgrown drive. The engine turned over, coughed once, then died. He tried again, and again, the battery whirring weakly, then falling silent. He got out, slamming the door. He couldn't be trapped here. He began to walk, heading for the winding dirt track that led back to the nearest road. But the woods, so familiar from his arrival, seemed to conspire against him. The path narrowed, branches clawing at his clothes, obscuring his vision. Trees he remembered as towering sentinels now seemed to shift, their forms blurring, rearranging themselves. Every turn looked the same, yet subtly different. The light filtering through the canopy grew thinner, stained with a sickly yellow. He walked for what felt like hours, circling, growing increasingly disoriented. Then, the world around him dissolved. He was no longer Dean, walking through a forest. He was a different man, cloaked in heavy wool, his hands rough and calloused. Before him, bound to a rough-hewn post, was a figure, small and whimpering. The air vibrated with a palpable presence, a vast, ancient hunger that clawed at his own gut, twisting it into a knot of desperate yearning. He felt a profound, terrible understanding of the sacrifice, a grim necessity. He could taste the fear of the victim, sharp and metallic, and felt the entity's immense satisfaction, a terrible, consuming warmth that filled the room, pressing in on him, on everything. He was both the giver and the receiver, the fear and the hunger, trapped in a horrifying communion. He gasped, stumbling back, the hallucination shattering like glass. He was on the dirt track again, the woods still and silent around him, but the light was almost gone. The house wasn't just old wood. It was an active participant, a hungry maw, and it had just shown him a glimpse of what it truly craved. Urban planning had always been about control, about shaping chaos into order. This house, however, defied every principle he held dear. It was an organism, a predatory ecosystem that had slowly, insidiously, begun to digest him. He stumbled into the study, the last remaining bastion of his former self, a room still clinging to the illusion of normalcy. The stack of journals lay scattered across the desk, their brittle pages filled with looping, frantic script. He had avoided the final entries, a primal part of him recoiling from the inevitable truth he knew they contained. Now, with the house's breath cold against his neck, there was no escaping them. His fingers, trembling despite his forced resolve, closed around the last, thin volume. The words blurred at first, a jumble of archaic phrasing and increasingly desperate pleas. Then, a name leaped out, his own. Dean. Not just a name, but a prophecy. The journal spoke of a lineage, a pact forged generations ago, not with some distant relative, but with the very walls that surrounded him. His ancestor, a man named Elias, had chronicled the discovery of the entity, a primordial hunger unearthed during an ill-fated expedition to a remote canyon research site. The entity, nameless and vast, craved sustenance, not of flesh, but of consciousness, of life force, of the very light that animated the world. The family, in exchange for something unspeakable, power, longevity, wealth. Someone had agreed to feed it. And Dean, as the last living descendant, was the next offering. The journal didn't use the words sustenance provider or host, it used a term far more chilling, the consumption. He wasn't to be a sacrifice, he was to be absorbed. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to originate from the very bedrock beneath the foundation. The walls of the study began to ripple, not subtly, but with a visible, sickening undulation. Plaster cracked and peeled, not falling, but curling inward like desiccated skin. Dean's breath hitched in his throat, a dry, rasping sound. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, stagnant water, and something else, something metallic and sweet, like old blood. The light from his flashlight, once a defiant beam, now seemed to struggle, its luminescence dimming, as if being actively drawn from the air. He tried to move, to back away from the desk, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. The house was not merely old wood and stone, it was an enormous, ravenous mouth, its architecture a skeletal framework for something utterly grotesque. The ceiling sagged, twisting into a grotesque canopy of warped beams and wet, glistening surfaces. He heard a wet, sucking sound from the adjacent hallway, a sound like a vast, patient stomach digesting. This wasn't a metaphor, it was real. The entity was revealing itself, not as a monster with fangs and claws, but as the house itself, a living, breathing, consuming organ. Panic clawed at his throat, a raw, desperate scream that never quite broke free. He was trapped, not by walls, but by an encroaching, suffocating presence. He could feel a subtle pull, a draining sensation, as if his very essence was being siphoned away. His thoughts began to fray, memories fragmenting like shards of glass. The walls pressed in, the ceiling descended, not crushing him, but enveloping him. The air grew impossibly heavy, tasting of dust and decay, and something else, a flavor of profound emptiness. He was no longer Dean, not entirely. He was a sensation, a fading spark of consciousness being drawn into something immeasurable, something ancient and infinitely hungry. The house settled, its ancient timbers groaning with a deep, contented sigh. The light in the study, what little remained, flickered once, then extinguished, leaving only the profound, impenetrable gloom. The mansion, its hunger temporarily appeased, waited patiently for the next generation, for the next spark to ignite within its walls, ready for its next consumption.